Thank you for listening to the Matt's Movie Reviews podcast, available on Podbean, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, and Stitcher. Also, please follow Matt's Movie Reviews on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, Reddit, Instagram, and MeWe. And of course, be sure to visit mattsmoviereviews.net for the latest reviews, top 10 lists, and more. Now, on to the show.
What is the history of metal and horror? Let's find out.
I think what makes effective horror is that it registers the anxiety of the humans that are watching it. That's what horror does best.
My favorites by far, if anybody knows me, it's a Universal Monsters. That's my whole life.
My mom took me to see the original Jaws when I was really young, and it scarred me for life.
The first VHS tape I ever had was Dawn of the Dead, and I would just let it play over and over all day long. I must have watched it thousands of times.
The movie that affected me the most was Salem's Lot.
Hellraiser is another massive great film, and I remember watching that for the first time and being totally blown away with it.
It's human, it's not human, and then there's this little matter of having a whole bunch of nails banged into your head. Sounds like a crazy idea.
The Groovy Ghoulies were on. I was obsessed with that show. It didn't seem that different to me, the Bugs Bunny to the Frankenstein. Like, it really was a natural kind of thing.
Of course, like most kids, I was watching cartoons on Saturdays, but I was also watching horror movies.
Captain Spaulding triggered the rebellious nature of people, and that is kind of the attitude that goes along with metal and horror.
Black Sabbath was a Boris Karloff film, right? You know, that's where they got the name from the film, and they combined it with heavy music, and that's how heavy metal was born.
You had people on one hand doing horror music, and you had people on the other hand doing horror film, and then somewhere in the middle where these two circles crossed, you had a hybrid.
I use the music, a lot of metal music, for listening to in between violent scenes. It just helps my energy.
I still get goosebumps when the skeleton comes up and starts saying, "Do you want a party?" It was like, okay, now chaos is gonna ensue.
For years and years, I've been a fan of Metallica. I just think they're awesome.
I know there are people out there who love horror. I know there are people who love heavy metal, and I know there are people who love both. I'm reaching out to those people and saying, hey man, I'm into it too, and I got a lot of cool stuff. You can just come over and check it out.
Horror and metal really became co-defendants in the Satanic Panic scandal.
Rock and roll is the devil, and horror is the devil too, so it's perfectly natural.
Metal and horror, a perfect match.
Hello and welcome to the Matt's Movie Reviews podcast. I am your host, Matthew Pejkovic, and this is episode number 433. A movie currently on the festival circuit is The History of Metal and Horror, a documentary that delves into two succinctly dark and rebellious forms of art and how they often converged throughout the decades. Featuring interviews with the likes of Kirk Hammett from Metallica, horror filmmaker John Carpenter, the legendary Alice Cooper, and many more. The History of Metal and Horror also marks the feature film directorial debut of Mike Schiff, who I'm glad to say joins me now on the podcast. Mike, how you doing?
Good, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And for people to check out information about the history of metal and horror, I really recommend going to metalhorror.com. That's the official website. And also go to their Facebook page too. So that is at The Metal Horror. Really good Facebook page, which was saying to you, Mike, off air, you know, not a lot of indie filmmakers take care of their socials. I think it's a really important factor in getting your word out there. And you guys update that Facebook all the time. So for people who want to check out which festivals are nearby that might be screening the film, or hopefully when a release date comes out as well, distribution, etc., that's the best place to go about it. So I'm sure you've heard this before, Mike. Metal and horror. You know, for me, these are my two favorite things. You know, I'm a big time metalhead. I'm a big time horror fan. You know, I always thought that there was like a kinship between the two. It taps into kind of like similar themes. the visual element is similar as well. But I'm really surprised that no one has really kind of delved into the the whole kind of collaborative aspect between the two. How did you kind of come about with the idea of something that was just so there, but no one wanted to just tap into it yet? How did you kind of think about, you know what, I think it's about time someone put this together?
Yeah, so it was in 2014, I attended Kirk Hammett's Fear Festival convention in California. And so he wanted to put on a show that was a combination of his two favorite genres of art, which is heavy metal and horror. So he put on a weekend-long convention that consisted of a lot of his own personal collection, his horror collection. He brought together artists, celebrities from both the heavy metal and horror world into one place. And then after the weekend, I realized that there hadn't really been a documentary made on why there is this connection between heavy metal and horror, which is pretty obvious to many of us, but no one really made a film about it. So I decided that with the context that I had, with the context that my producer and friend Robert Lucas had, we were able to start getting some interviews together and kind of built it along the way. So here we are. It took about 6.5 years of production and finally came together. So that's basically how the idea came about.
Between yourself and your producer, Robert, who took care of the metal side of it? Who took care of the horror side of it?
It wasn't one or the other. It was just, my friend Rob had a lot of friends in the horror world, especially. Right. So he really introduced me to a lot of these people. So, he's good friends with Bill Moseley and Doug Bradley and Tom Savini and all these guys. So over the years, I had become friendly with them. So it was a lot easier to get them involved in the film because they already knew me, they trusted me, and we had a good rapport with each other. With a lot of the other ones, maybe Alice Cooper, Dave Mustaine, guys like that. A lot of that was just kind of knowing people who knew people. So I'm pretty close with Jose Mangan from SiriusXM, and of course he's well connected with everything that is heavy metal. So I've known him for years. He was able to hook me up with guys like Dave Mustaine and others. So a lot of it was that. And for some of the other ones, it was just reaching out to the artist management directly. Not having any previous connection to anyone, but just saying, hey, I'd like to interview so-and-so for my film that I'm doing. Here's who I have involved so far. And then sometimes it would work out where the management would hook it up and make the interview happen. And other times it just wasn't good timing, or there wasn't, a lot of other things might have happened. Someone might have been ill for a while and weren't available. So one thing I always say to people who wonder why, so-and-so wasn't in the film, chances are if there's someone you have in mind that you feel should be in the movie, chances are I did try to get them and it didn't work out. So, because that's always a question of, hey, how come you didn't have King Diamond in there? Or how come you didn't have Ozzy in there? Well, I've tried, and for whatever reason, the timing didn't work out for a lot of people. But anyways, that's kind of a long answer to the question. But yeah, it was that's just kind of how it all came about as far as the metal and horror people.
So you mentioned before the whole Kirk Hammett kind of exhibition that he had with she shows off this impressive collection that he's had over the years. It seems to me the impression that I got when watching the documentary was that the heavy metal musicians were just such big fans of the horror genre, and it really does influence a lot of visual themes that they have for the music and lyrical content, etc. But when you look at the flip side of it, people who work in horror, for example, it doesn't really feel like that many of them would be listening to Slayer in their off time. You know what I mean? I wouldn't be surprised, in fact, if maybe, John Carpenter probably listens to more, like Echo and the Bunnymen than he would Pantera, right?
Probably,
even though he is a more of a rather, he does incorporate quite a bit of heavy music in his work. Is that something that you found rather quickly as well, that the fanaticism wasn't as equal for one another's different perspective genres from both sides?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when we're talking about a lot of the horror stars, most of them are of a different generation, as opposed to a lot of the metal stars who, some of them, like the guys from Avatar are, they're millennials, I guess, or, they're sort of the newer generation. Whereas, you have John Carpenter, Tom Savini, a lot of these guys are, they're old school. They didn't listen to the metal that just really became popular in the 80s. They were listening to a lot of stuff prior to that, 60s, 70s. So, maybe they got into Zeppelin and other bands like that. But as far as the more modern metal, they just didn't, just wasn't their thing. So while they're not necessarily fans of the music, I think they respect it enough, certainly enough to be part of this film, to discuss it and discuss the connection, because they have, even though they're not really fans of the genre per se, they have developed relationships with a lot of the metal artists themselves over the years, because the metal artists are fans of these guys. So they'll go to the conventions and say, maybe Wednesday 13 or someone might be at a convention with Savini or Bill Moseley or whoever and say, hey, I'm just a really big fan of yours for many years. And after seeing each other, year after year at conventions, then they become friends. So in that sense, there is a sort of a connection with the two, even though like one might be a fan of the other's work and not so much the other way around. But that's definitely pretty common. So it was pretty, it happened fairly often where one of the horror artists would say, I'm not really a fan of metal. I don't really have much to say about it. So I'd mostly focus on their career, what their influence on the genre was, and what sort of connection they've seen throughout the years.
What's really interesting about your film, the history of metal and horror, as opposed to other documentaries that get set my way, and I get so many of them as well, is that you have kind of like a almost like a film narrative aspect in the movie. It's kind of like a movie within the movie. Which is really interesting to me. It kind of begins, and I was watching it. I was like, did I click on the right link here? I wasn't. What's going on? It begins with kind of like this post-apocalyptic world. You got this lone survivor. He finds like this kick-ass guitar. He finds like, it looks like kind of like 8-track kind of tapes, but they're really not. There might be some type of, Anyway, it shows the history of the world, and he's watching the whole thing about history of metal and horror. So he's watching the documentary along with us. Really interesting kind of way, really interesting concept to kind of like bring this information to the fore. How did that idea come about? Because I thought it was really well done. And you have a really good jump scare in there as well, by the way. I don't want to tell anyone what it is because, of course, it's a surprise, but the really good jump scare in there as well.
Thanks. I knew from the start that I didn't want to make just a very standard form documentary, which, most documentaries for the most part are, it's just interviews and B-roll and transitions. Maybe there's, some kind of a host who's kind of guiding the audience through it, but I wanted to do something a little bit different. So I wanted to do a short film that would serve as a sort of a segment, introduction along the way, so that it wasn't just graphic transitions or just a host off screen saying, okay, now we're going into this. And I wanted it to actually be a film that would sort of keep the attention of the audience. Like, all right, where is this story going? How is it going to progress along with the documentary? How's it going to end? So I wanted to have something that would sort of bookend it that way, but also kind of keep things a little bit more interesting and just try to do something different. Also, ultimately I want to write and direct feature films. So this was also an opportunity to do a short film that I can kind of incorporate into the overall project. So it was kind of more fun for me in that sense, knowing that I wasn't just doing sort of a standard formula. I was doing something a little bit, a little bit more wild in that sense.
You have the great Michael Berryman in the movie. He's kind of like the guide of the film. Kind of like he's a person. He's a narrator. He's kind of like all sorts of different aspects. How did he kind of get involved in everything metal and horror?
So I was trying to figure out who would be a good host for it, and I was kind of brainstorming. I was talking to friends, and so my friends. Eben McGarr from the Mad Monster conventions and James Balsamo, who's also a filmmaker. They've worked with him before. So they said, what about Michael Berryman? I was like, that's the guy. That's the guy I want to get. Yeah. So they put me in touch with his management. I reached out, and it was pretty straightforward. There weren't a lot of hoops to jump through, and we made it happen. So he flew down to my friend Rob's studio in Burbank, in California, and in maybe half a day, if that, we filmed all his stuff on a green screen, and all the rest of the stuff for the short film I shot in New York. So I shot all this stuff here in New York, and then I flew out to Burbank to get all the Michael Berryman stuff. Then I brought that back home and put it all together. But yeah, he was very easy to work with, very interesting guy, and of course also a legend in the business. I mean, he's been around forever, and and even if you're not really familiar with his films, you know the face. He
Absolutely
has a very unique look. So everyone, once you see him, it's like, oh yeah, I recognize that guy. And of course, as a horror fan, that's Michael Berryman, legend in the business.
Yeah. The Matt's Movie Reviews podcast is brought to you by 80s Tees. 80s Tees is an online retailer of licensed t-shirts and pop culture gear from your favorite movies, TV shows, cartoons, video games, comic books, and musicians. Celebrate your inner 80s nerd and click on the link in the show notes below to get the raddest retro t-shirts delivered to your door. The Matt's Movie Reviews podcast is brought to you by Loot Crate. Founded in 2012, Loot Crate is the worldwide leader in fan subscription boxes. Loot Crate partners with industry leaders in entertainment, gaming, sports, and pop culture to deliver monthly themed crates, produce interactive experiences in digital content, and film original video productions. No matter what you geek out about, Loot Crate has a subscription box for you. To get your very own exclusive collectibles, apparel, and gear delivered to your door, be sure to click on the link in the show notes below. The Matt's Movie Reviews podcast is brought to you by TeePublic. TeePublic is the world's largest marketplace for independent creators to sell their work on the highest quality merchandise. With over 1.2 million designs, TeePublic is sure to have something you love. It's really interesting how in the movie, in your documentary, there is a person watching the TV screen learning about, horror movies. And what I found really interesting about, especially when we were speaking to the heavy metal musicians, a lot of them were introduced to the concept of horror or horror movies through TV. Not only were there TV serials like Twilight Zone back then, but there were these kind of crazy 6 p.m. Variety show type kind of things where it'll be a host and he'll introduce a movie, maybe an obscure kind of thing. And a lot of these different artists, depending on where they are geographically around America, they'll have their own version of that in the state that they're in. Because I think it might have been a lot of kind of community TV that they might have been watching. Is that something that you found as well? That a lot of them were introduced to cinema through TV, which is kind of weird because it's almost kind of pathetic in a way that a lot of people are watching movies today, right? That are watching it through small screens.
Yeah, for sure. And because, it takes a little bit of time and effort to take the kids out to the movies, out to the theaters and stuff. So that's not necessarily something that most families would do on a regular basis. So, so you get out, especially if it's on Sunday, a lot of Sundays were big days for a lot of these programs. That's when I used to watch. And so, parents, they're tired. They just want to take the Sunday off. So what do the kids do? The kids sit around, they, maybe watch some TV. And they flip through channels, and then they, come across the horror programs, which of course we all loved. So that was a very easy way to just get a lot of films, into your data bank of a mind. So, and that could be a weekly thing, so it's like a regular thing that doesn't really cost anything. It's in your own home. You just turn on the TV and there you go. You just got a whole bunch of horror movies every week. So it's a very easy way to get it. So, and especially people who just, didn't have the resources or whatever to just go out to the movies and see all the new stuff constantly. It was just there for everybody. So that was definitely very, a popular thing amongst a lot of the people in the film.
Let's talk about some of the people that you interviewed in this movie. We'll start with kind of the person kind of started the whole thing, which is Kirk Hammett. He's such an interesting guy because he's kind of almost like the quiet man in Metallica. Because of course, for people who know the band, James Hetfield and Lars Ulrich are kind of the mouthpieces of the band. The thing about him that I find really interesting is that the more documentaries I watch where he's involved in it, he just comes across as a really kind of cool dude who's got such great interests in the horror thing, especially you've seen it when he's on stage. He's got guitars that kind of have designs of classic monster people on his guitars and such. You mentioned before this collection. How much of the collection did you see? Did you only see what was in exhibition in New York at that time, or did you actually get to see more of it as you got to interview him? Because supposedly his collection of stuff is just incredible.
Yeah, I mean, he has a massive collection. I only saw part of it. And even guys like Ron Chaney Jr. and others who attended the convention said that even though they've known him for years, they've only seen a fraction of it. I think that at his home and his warehouse, wherever he keeps everything, I don't know how many people have really seen everything, but he took what he felt the fans would really be into, and he packed them all into trucks, loaded them down to the convention, put them on display everywhere throughout the whole place, and I saw a fair amount. So I definitely, we saw a lot that he had on display. I think he had another event maybe in, I don't know, it was further up north, maybe even Canada. I'm not sure. Some years back, where he put on another event, which I didn't attend. But yeah, I'm sure whatever he had at his convention was just a portion of his overall collection. I'm sure it's much more massive. He's just a major collector, and has been for many years. So when you have the space and the the finances to support that kind of a hobby, then you can definitely build a very impressive collection.
Absolutely. I mean, that Black Album alone, I'm sure they'd pay for half of the stuff that he has in storage.
I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Another person he interviewed as well was Alice Cooper, and he's just such a fascinating man to me. It comes back to like the whole Wayne's World aspect of his personality, which is, the king of shock rock, the man who, brought to the fore a lot of these kind of elements the first time. And then behind the scenes, he's just such a personable and intelligent man. And on top of all of that, his spiritual upbringing, his current religious kind of like status, he's a Christian as well. People don't know this. He's a Christian as well. And he speaks about in a film about how he and Marilyn Manson, many times, will have debates about, their different, theological, kind of like clashing of theology. What was he like to interview? Because he's a guy that I would love to sit down and talk to, because he just comes across, number one, not only as just a really cool guy, but someone who's really kind of knowledgeable. Because, you say what you want about people like Marilyn Manson or whoever. When they came out, like in the 90s or whenever, they had 2 decades of stuff before them to kind of break the ice with the public about what can be deemed acceptable. When Alice Cooper came out, like in the late 60s, early 70s, no one was doing what he was doing. He was taking fresh balls for everyone back in the time. So what was it like interviewing him and getting his kind of wisdom and perspective on just the themes that you're tackling in your movie?
He was awesome because, he... of course, he's one of the originators. He's one of the guys who started this whole thing of incorporating horror into rock music, and so many other artists just followed in his footsteps along the way, and they all have so much respect for him and what he's done. And he's still out there. He's still out there touring just as much as he ever did. And I think what was most impressive about him was just the fact that he was so humble and just so generous with his time. Sometimes you expect someone of his caliber to just be, if anything, if he's willing to give you any of his time for an interview, they might just be like, okay, I got 10 minutes, then I got to go. So let's make it quick. But he was just so cool, so relaxed. We filmed his interview at his restaurant, Cooperstown, and I think he ordered some food, probably earlier on when we started the interview. And I think the food was probably sitting there for maybe at least half an hour, just getting cold. And there was just no rush on his part. He was bringing food back to the family or whatever. But there was no rush. There was no like, oh, the food's here. Okay, let's see the last question. We got to go. It was just, just let us sit there. And he finished the interview. Let us get all the questions, and time for more if we wanted to. But I think we probably sat down with him maybe close to an hour. And he was so interesting, so knowledgeable, and just such a friendly guy. Such a very kind soul. So that was very impressive. And he's definitely someone I admire tremendously. Just not just for what he's created artistically, but just for being such a good person. Which sometimes can be hard to find, but he really has a reputation of being just one of the kindest people in the industry.
The interesting thing about, him is that, as I mentioned before, he kind of like took a lot of the bullets in regards to the controversy of what he does, and kind of like the mergings of like the theatrical horror elements to his music and his music himself. He was doing kind of like that whole kind of androgynous thing even before David Bowie was around to do it as well. And it kind of goes back to kind of like the controversial nature of horror and heavy metal, because they delve into themes and like mortality and religion and all sorts of different kind of stuff that a lot of people tend not to want to dive into when it comes to their pop culture entertainment. And I think it says something about the 1980s as a decade that both of these genres really flourished in that time. There's something about that decade where it kind of, everything just kind of like came to the fore, and people were taking risks, and there was like advances in, makeup technology in horror, for example, where they can do things on screen. And when it comes to the heavy metal musicians, there's an evolution there as well. Do you think, the kind of like these two kind of genres coming together, kind of feeding off each other in the 80s, do you think it only could be done in that decade? Could you foresee it happening again today? Because I don't know about you, there's something about that decade, especially in the 80s, especially with the advancements of VHS and all these other stuff as well, that it was the perfect conditions for these two genres especially to kind of flourish.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it was just a perfect storm, I think, in the 80s. I think certainly with film, film got easier to produce. You got much greater advances in special effects, of course. So you were able to create a lot more stuff. Whereas there were maybe a few more limitations prior to the 80s. You could only kind of dream about things that you really wanted to do. But then once you got into the 80s and you had all these new advancements and these new special effects artists who were just innovators, then horror just really, really exploded. And then, of course, when you make one film, another filmmaker gets the idea and then say, that kind of inspired me to do this. And then you have a lot of different people bouncing off of each other. I think metal kind of worked the same way also, but everything sort of has an evolution. I mean, metal, goes back to the blues, and without the blues, you wouldn't have had rock and then metal. So everything has to have sort of an origin. And that's sort of the origin of metal. So it needed that time to sort of evolve and develop. And it seems like horror and metal just kind of, really ramped up a lot at the same time. And I don't, maybe it's coincidental. I don't know, but it was just, and I think that just took a lot of parents, by surprise. It was just like coming from both ends. It wasn't just like, oh, here's this horror stuff that's really, our kids are really into, but also here's metal. So what do we do? So a lot of people were kind of freaking out about these two genres that were very popular at the same time. And of course, if you're a fan, of one, you're probably more likely than not a fan of the other. So now, like, you're buying metal music, you're buying horror films, so you can go, buy your cassettes or your CDs, in one store, and then you can buy your VHSs in another. So then you're collecting all this stuff, and now you have a huge library of things. And this hadn't happened, prior to the 80s. Like, you're not going to collect film reels, or anything like that. So it made collecting the media so much easier as well in the 80s. It was just so much more accessible and so much more affordable too. So it just all happened together at the same time, I guess.
And I think that's really something that brought kind of like the whole satanic panic thing of that time to the fore as well, because it seems to me that the more accessible this stuff got, the physical media nature of it, especially in regards to, like, you can rent stuff at a video store. Like, people talk about Netflix now and all that. I don't know why, but I just so much preferred back in the day when we can walk into a store and there's just all the videos there and you see the artwork and everything as well, and you can bring it home. I just love that stuff. But that's a whole thing that I'm getting to. You're buying the stuff and you're bringing it into the home, and the home is supposed to be like this solitude that kind of blocks out what our parents hope will block out any type of what they perceive to be negative influence. And then all of a sudden their children are bringing that into their home. They have the posters on the wall. They have the vinyl or CD collection. They have, they're watching, Evil Dead maybe or stuff like that. And how important do you think it is, the whole physical media aspect of it? Because not only are you bringing the stuff home, but it's in itself, the packaging is in itself a visual representation of the band. You have great artwork, you have great posters, you have, Eddie from the Iron Maiden, or you have the King Diamond stuff, or whatever it would be. That stuff is, you can look at it any time. You can open up the liner notes. There's great artwork in there. How do you put anything that was as well? And kind of like how both of these kind of different succinctly different genres, but similar genres, kind of like tackled the kind of visual approach and how they kind of melded together, kind of like as you present in your documentary.
Yeah, I mean, I feel bad for generations that came after ours, because they'll never know what it was like to really just know that a new album is coming out or a new VHS or something, and once you get to the store, it's going to be like there, like unless it sells out, like you rush to the store to get it, and then like you have it in your hand. It's like, wow, I finally got it. I've been waiting all this time, and then to have something in your hand where with the albums you could look at the lyrics, learn the lyrics, from the booklets, look at the artwork. VHS is kind of the same thing. It was cool to just have a copy of something, even if you're just renting it, going into a video store to just kind of see what just came out and just browse, look for stuff that you've never heard of before, but the cover looks cool, so you want to check it out and everything. So I do feel bad for newer generations who will just never really understand that. So, and they don't really know what it's like, so they're not going to miss it, in that sense. But I think that like at least in my generation, I feel there was just a lot more stuff to appreciate in a different kind of way, instead of just having everything just immediately at your fingertips, on your phone or streaming on your TV. You just push a button and it's there. I think there was a certain, a level of excitement that people aren't going to have again in that sense. So physical media, I think it still has a place for a lot of people. I think there are definitely, I still get people messaging me all the time. Hey, when's the DVD coming out? Sometimes not even Blu-ray. It's like, I said, hey, well, I might get the Blu-rays first. Do you want a Blu-ray? It's like, no, I just collect DVDs. So, let me know when the DVD's out. So there are still people who just love to have the hard copies, the physical media, especially if you're at a convention and you want to get it signed by someone. So that, you have to, you can't get a streaming song or a movie signed by anybody, by your favorite celebrity. It has to be physical. Yeah. So people still love collecting the movies or the albums and having that actual piece signed by the creator. So I think there still will be a market for that. It's just a little bit different in a sense, but hopefully that won't be going away anytime soon.
Speaking of when we can expect, the history of metal and horror to be, released to the masses. I know you're doing a lot of kind of festival stuff right now. The movies like that there. I know here in Australia, we just had the Monster Fest weekends, and they were showing a movie here as well. I think in New Zealand this weekend, I believe they might be doing some more Monster Fest weekends as well, and you can see the movie there. But what about any type of news regarding a digital or physical release, anything like that you can share at the moment?
Yes, I'm working on that now. I've been, over the past year, I've been doing the film festival circuit. So that's been a great way to just meet a lot of people, make a lot of connections, get some ideas of how I wanted to release this ultimately. I've been approached by a couple of distribution companies, and for the most part, I haven't been too excited about their offers. A lot of them want long-term deals with very little guarantee as far as the payoff goes. So it's possible I might retain some control and sell on my own and maybe work with different companies, but it's in the works now. So it's the wheels are in motion. I'm still listening to different offers to see what's going to be the best deal. I think I'm pretty solid on what I'm going to do as far as the physical media goes. So that might be maybe about 8 to 10 weeks out. It's just going to take a little time for the disc authoring and the duplications and all that kind of stuff. So. But I think that I'm getting ready to just make that deal and get that going, so that I know that in a couple of weeks it's going to be out there and available. As far as streaming, it's still on a couple of people's table, so they're looking at it and again just kind of looking to get the best deal possible, because unfortunately there are a lot of desperate filmmakers out there who just want to get the first deal they get. Yeah. And just say, oh, here's my movie, take the rights and do whatever you want with it. I just want it out there. I want to say that, my movie's, out there on DVD, Blu-ray and streaming. But for me personally, I spent so many years on it. I really want to be happy with the deal that I get. So I'm taking my time with that. And I know that there are people who are just sort of, wondering, and patiently, of course, everyone's been really great. But I know that they're waiting for this to finally get out there after all these years. So I want to get it out there as soon as possible. But I just want to make sure I'm happy with the decision I make, because once you make a deal, you're kind of locked into that for a certain amount of time. So I don't want to have any regrets about doing something that I'm not ultimately happy with. So, but things are in motion, and it's not one of these things where, well, I don't know, it could be a couple of years before it's finally out there. It's like, no, it's definitely, within the next 2 months or so, it'll be available.
Well, I can't wait for everyone to watch this when they can, because I really love the history of metal and horror. As a big fan of both, I was incredibly satisfied with what I watched. And I think, sometimes people can promise the world and give you nothing but a pile of dirt. But this is a treasure trove of riches here for both my metal and horror sides. And for everyone out there, the history of metal and horror, you can go to metalhorror.com to find out information. You can also check out the Facebook page. I'm sure any type of news that you have, Mike, in regards to releases and such, people can find there. And if anyone out there, if they see this film prop up in a local festival or what have you, jump on it, watch the film. You will absolutely love it. I know that I did. And Mike, I absolutely loved our conversation today as well. It's been a pleasure talking to you. It's so nice to meet you. And again, man, I really love the documentary. As a diehard fan of both heavy metal and horror, I was very happy with what you presented, and you did it in such a unique way as well, which I also appreciate, considering all the movies that I watch every week. So that was really cool, man. Thank you so much for your time, and hopefully, let me know when you get any news. I'll be happy to push it out there and let people know about it. And when you get another project, let me know as well. I'd love to watch that and talk about that as well.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the kind words and support. It definitely makes it all worthwhile, to really create something that people appreciate to that extent. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you for watching the Matt's Movie Reviews channel. Please subscribe for more reviews, podcast interviews, and exclusive content. Also, if you would like to request a review and support my work, please join my Patreon via the link in the description below.